Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're excited to have you here for the second day of Open Ed Live 2026. Seeing some
Welcome in,
names from
everyone.
yesterday. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'd love it if you would say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from today. As we're getting started, I'm going to start going through a couple housekeeping slides before our first presentation that'll start at noon. We're really excited to have 35 US states plus Canada, Morocco, and Iraq represented right now. If you could keep introducing yourself in the chat, that would be wonderful. It's great to see where everyone is coming from. Our agenda today is going to be super fun. We're going to start with demonstrating impact using data to tell the story of open education, which is going to speak really well to some of the themes we were exploring yesterday. At 1 o'clock, we're going to go into a drop-in discussion looking at open beyond the textbook with some considerations of virtual labs. And then at 2 o'clock, we're going to have a conversation that's going to be strategic investment in open education from both the faculty and administrative perspectives. So if you weren't able to join us yesterday, if you'd like to take a look at this quick survey, this is going to give us a sense of who's in the room, the roles that you're hailing from, the kind of subjects that you support, and anything that you're hoping to get from this session and conference. From yesterday's analytics, it looks like we have a mostly faculty audience, which is fabulous. Second only, coming up right below that is librarians. And then all of the other roles sort of speaking to one by one. I want to do a quick highlight of the STARS repository. This is UCF's institutional repository, which is going to be where we're going to house sessions from previous talks. And you'll be able to go back and hear recordings of all of the great conversations that we're having this week. Quick plug for Open Education Week, which is coming up next week with a whole bunch of events to celebrate, March 2nd through 6th out of OE Global. For UCF faculty in the room, we want to highlight a workshop offering that we're doing internally to continue some of the conversations that we're having right now. So if you're coming here from the University of Central Florida, we'd love for you to sign up and keep joining those conversations. Plug for Open Florida's OER Bootcamp, back to the state of Florida level and national and beyond. So if you're free at the end of March, it's going to be a great event. We'd love to see everyone there. Plug for the Open Ed Mic podcast, which came up a few times yesterday, co-hosted by Kevin Corcoran, and will feature a whole bunch of speakers that you'll also hear here. So if you'd like to take that look, Kevin, if you want to drop any other plugs for that in the chat. And another look at what is coming up for our day 2 agenda, starting with Virginia Clinton-Lisell. Going to be talking about demonstrating impact using data to tell the story of open. And now that was way too much of me talking. So let's move it back to some larger group conversations. So yesterday we had some fun with talking about what superpower you might bring to the open education movement, sort of concentrated on Jedi mind powers to convince all of the administrative everyone's. So today, if you were stranded on a desert island, building an open course from scratch, what is one OER tool, platform, or resource that you would bring with you? And from pre-conversation, that's going to start with, yes, you do in fact have internet access.
It's a really good question. Kind of a tough one too, but I'm glad we have internet access. Someone mentioned Google.
Oh, very nice.
Jarvis from Tony Stark.
Amazing.
OER Commons, that's a good one.
That's a good one. So we're centering in repository land. Oh, libguides, just widely defined.
Do you honestly need anything else in life other than a LibGuide?
One of the jokes around here is libguides are the deus machina. Any problem that you have, a libguide's going to solve.
I see Merlot, I see database access, and a librarian.
Oh, friendly
Yay.
neighborhood librarian on a desert island.
I would love to have time on an island.
That seems like a better function than Gilligan's Island. We were missing a librarian to go with the professor.
It looks like we have a thoughtful Curtis Bonk's The World is Open book for grounding in foundational lessons learned, and of course, Merlot repository access. EPUB software. These are all really good ideas. And it's interesting to see what's highlighted too. Like what comes to your mind first? What tool for open education would you take if it was you could only have one thing? A Gen AI tool. Yeah, curious what the preferred one would be.
Which one? Welcome, everyone. If you're just joining us, we're having an open conversation about what tool you would bring if you were stranded on a desert island to support open education. This might be a little bit mean given the weather hitting all people in the US. So it's a little bit fantasy aspiration.
I mean, it could be a really cold desert island.
Desert island in the sand.
Curious so as we've kind of moved from talking about, okay, what open education related tool would you take to a desert island? What are some takeaways from yesterday that folks would like to share? If you attended any sessions from yesterday, what's one thing that comes to mind?
For me, everyone who's been within a 5 foot radius has had to hear about open pedagogy as an opportunity for scholarship in teaching and learning. That pretty much blew my mind.
I still see a couple ideas coming through. Is a cat on my lap a resource? It would help my productivity anyway. That is a good option. And sunscreen was also really critical too.
Lily, what would have your takeaway from yesterday have been if you had to pick just one?
Oh, from the keynote presentation yesterday on building bridges relating to micro-credentials, I'd never really thought about micro-credentials to the level of how can we kind of incorporate open education with that? Where's that intersection? And just thinking about learning components as being smaller building blocks. I think that really helped contextualize those things.
A chat, Lisa challenging us to rethink OER format into microlearning. Similar conversation. And sort of the movement from open resources as textbook replacements to some of those more flexible, granular building blocks, as Lily was just saying. Andy directing us to department chairs for conversations to value OE efforts.
It's another really good takeaway.
And brings us back to Jedi mind powers.
Yeah, yesterday's icebreaker question was about superpowers, so definitely talking about that a good bit. Okay, I thought the comment in the chat was a little mean. It said, and Kevin knowing nothing on blockchain, but it was contributed by Kevin himself. So there you go. During that drop-in session, I thought it was a thoughtful answer, even though blockchain may not be your area of expertise.
Maybe Lego blocks. As the slides are going through, welcome everyone. We'll get started in about 5 minutes. highlighting the STARS repository, which is where you can see recordings of the conversations we're talking about right now after they've completed caption. So I wonder if anyone had questions from yesterday they'd like to put in the chat that we can all just sort of group think back onto. I know there were a lot of new ideas, a lot of different ways to look at some of the things that we've talked about in the past. Yeah, great question. So, what is the top challenge in the role that you're sitting in right now that you're facing? If you want to put those in the chat, scale, yes.
Definitely a challenge.
And Jennifer, I'd be curious, just where are you coming at scale from? Is that scaling adoption across faculty resources? Is that scaling at the programmatic level? So see, breaking silos, absolutely. Continuing financial support for open education. And from yesterday's conversation, financial support and also looking at the ways that we value in ways that are outside of the financial backing. Time, yes, Emily. And that speaks to scale. From the chat, I'm wondering if microlearning can work in AI supported learning, such as adaptive learning. Yeah, I come from an adaptive learning background and I was putting my granularization hat on yesterday. If we can break those units down into super tiny granular micro elements that build on each other and add some kind of needs assessment, student facing micro learning onto that, it'd be so powerful. Belief that OER is inferior, myth busting, those went really well together. Questions about data and how we're using it, administrative support. They forget about libraries despite my constant excitement on new ideas. Sure. See from the chat, currently California is funding OER and ZTC efforts, preparing to transition after that funding ends. And that goes back to scale and longevity. What kind of support structures we're putting in place. Another round of open textbook grants. That's fabulous. So we're coming up at 1 minute to the hour. We'll get started on today's session. Right now, for those just joining us, talking about what challenges we're facing, how we can crowdsource them, see some of these efforts and challenges being duplicated. Continuing conversations about micro-credentials back in the non-conference real world.
As we head into our first session of the day in under 1 minute, just for a broad overview of what we have in store for today. Starting now, we will have demonstrating impact using data to tell the story of open education with Dr. Virginia Clinton-Lisell. And then that will go on for 45 minutes. And then at the top of the next hour, a drop-in session. And then at the top of the following hour, another session called Strategic Investment in Open Education. But now it is my distinct honor to welcome Dr. Virginia Clinton-Lisell. I had the privilege of meeting her in person at the Open Education Conference last year in October. Dr. Virginia Clinton-Lisell began her career in education as an ESL teacher in New York City. She then obtained her PhD in educational psychology with a minor in cognitive science at the University of Minnesota, where she was trained in educational research. She has published over 60 articles in education research and teaches courses in education research, program evaluation, and psychological foundations of education. Her current research focuses on the psychology of reading comprehension and open education. She is a primary researcher for the Open Education Group, which sponsors a fellowship for early career researchers. Round of virtual applause for Dr. Virginia Clinton-Lisell. Take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Lily, for the introduction. And I will share my love for data in this presentation. So, yes, hello, my name is Virginia and I love data. And let me see, we'll just do it like this. And one of the courses I teach is statistics, and normally I get students who are not thrilled to be taking statistics. And I keep hearing, well, I'm not good at math. I'm like, that it's not math. It is telling a story with numbers, with data. And it's not the only source of data, but I'll be talking about different sources and how to use them depending on the stakeholder. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation and interrupt at any time. So if I can get this to advance. Okay, whoops. All right, I want to begin by talking about a framework that Lindsay Gavush and Jasmine Roberts Cruz and I developed. We noticed that the open education field needed better theoretical grounding and a stronger framework or more comprehensive framework. So we developed this. And the purpose is to provide avenues for connecting research projects in open education to theories that are existing. So we call this the scope framework, and it connects to various theories related to social issues of fairness, opportunity, advocacy, and empowerment. Cost, which is losses that are due to or avoided by open education. Outcomes, which are the presumed effects to open education. This is often looked at in terms of grades, but there are numerous other outcomes that are important. Perception, which is what people think about open education, and engagement. And this is talking about being participating and actively involved. If you're interested in learning more about the framework, I have the citation and the QR code there. And just to give you an example of um, how the scope framework can be applied. This is a study that my colleague Allison Kelly in psychology and I conducted with almost 1,000 college students, asking them about their experiences needing to purchase access codes to do their homework. So these are publisher online homework systems where students are doing their homework online, but it's not through, say, the Blackboard or Canvas. It's through MindTap or um, through a Pearson product or a Cengage project. And we grounded our inquiry in this framework by looking at social issues where we intentionally examined first generation college students to see how their experiences were similar or different to continuing generation. Unfortunately, we found that more first generation students than continuing generation students were required to purchase access codes to do their homework. We looked at cost in terms of financial expense, but also the emotional cost involved. For outcomes, we looked at perceived learning. Did they find that these homework systems were helpful? For perceptions, we looked at perceived quality. Did they think that they were good? And then engagement, how much did they actually use these systems? So if you're curious about that, please feel free to use that QR code. to access the article. But I just wanted to give an example of how data could be used in the scope framework. And then I wanted to mention key audiences. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mention that these are some of our key stakeholders, go over various ways of collecting data with the scope framework, and then some conversation about which data for which stakeholders. So when we're thinking about our audience as open educators, we can think about policymakers at various levels of the government. So, in my case, I'm working usually with the state of North Dakota because I work for a public institution, and then also federal guidelines administrators at my institution, and then the North Dakota university system more broadly, my fellow educators, students, and then other stakeholders. So this would be community members, family members. I've really been pleasantly surprised that so many people are interested in the work I do in open education, and how it has been a way that I've been able to communicate or have a very specific way of showing people how I am supporting students and promoting students, because even people who've been out of college for years still remember how much their textbooks cost, or still much remember how much they had to pay, or hearing about students having to pay to do their homework, or all these other costs, and are really excited to hear that open education is an answer for a lot of these problems. Yes, I would be happy to share my slides after this. So as far as social issues, we can think about them in terms of redistributive, recognitive, and representational. Redistributive is talking about having resources provided for those who've been historically denied adequate resources. So open education addresses this by having that cost barrier removed. Recognitive is seeing yourself in the materials. Now, there's been work in open education that were not necessarily any better or worse than commercial textbook books in terms of having a variety of backgrounds shown in our materials. However, the benefit with open education is we can edit and change and accommodate to local context specifically. Like I've worked with one researcher who taught in Hawaii and worked with their students in an open pedagogy project to update their textbook to be more contextualized to Hawaiian issues. Representational justice is opportunity to speak from your unique experiences, and these data can either be qualitative or quantitative. So you could have interviews, observations, document analysis. You can, analyze um, these issues with those richer, more open-ended data, or you can also have more quantitative data where you're looking at numbers. So you're doing things like asking people, are you better able to your course readings now that you have an open textbook, as opposed to when you had to purchase a commercial textbook? I've worked on developing a survey about having a measure where we can ask people, do you feel that you get to speak from your own unique experiences in this open pedagogy project? Another component here is to examine your data with a lens towards fairness and asset-based assumptions. So an example of fairness is in that homework survey that I was talking about earlier. I looked at first generation students specifically because first generation students have more barriers towards completing a college degree than continuing education students. And I wanted to see if this issue of online homework systems was fair for them. It was not. And also to think about assets. So if you're looking at a group of students, to rather than just think about like where are they doing things not as well as other groups of students, to think more about like what are their strengths, where are they pulling from, what are ways where we can be aware of how to best support them. Cost. So, cost is a pretty straightforward seeming idea in open education because I don't know about all you, but I got into this field because I was fed up with how much my students were spending on materials. And I also knew that it wasn't, those materials were necessary. You know, that I needed a textbook, that there's just too much information. And reading things like academic journal articles, it's just not going to cut it with an introductory course. So, one cost to look at is the actual financial cost. Look at the cost of commercial materials. Now, there's a few different ways that you can do this. One is to estimate based on the cost of the commercial materials, to look at the actual money involved. The difficulty with doing that is historically students have been very smart and savvy about finding workarounds to not have to pay full price for commercial materials. Um, so one method that people use is they just estimate that, you know, about half the cost is on average what the average student would be paying. You can also survey students on the cost of materials. The downside with this, of course, is you're relying on students remembering what they spent, but you can usually get a fairly good idea based on that. I did that with one study, and then also with the open education section, I asked them to estimate how much they spent in terms of like, did you get it printed out? Think about like paper, printing costs, things like that. Just taking into account that there may be costs with accessing open digital materials. Withdrawal rates are a great way to quantify cost differences in terms of institutional cost, and then also the cost the student is going to have because they're paying tuition for a course that they withdraw from. And one reason that we're finding students withdraw from courses is because they're realizing they need those materials, but they can't afford them. Alternatively, they may uh, not withdraw because they realize they can just quickly click and access their digital materials. Emotional costs should be considered as well. So things such as the financial stress involved. Um, there's been work on how students who go into a class and the professor assumes they can all afford to spend hundreds of dollars on course materials, that students feel like that the professor doesn't care about them. Conversely, if they go into a course and the professor tells them, "Hey, the we only use open education here, so you don't have to buy anything for this course," students have more feelings that that professor cares about them and that their um, financial well-being and their well-being is important to the professor. Student stories can also be quite powerful here. So this would be taking more of a narrative approach and just, you know, asking students like, what are some of the things you do because of the cost of your course materials? And alternatively, one approach that has been done in open education is asking students, with that money that you would have spent on course materials, what did you do with that money? What are uh, some some ways that you have spent that. Now, this can be done through interviews and such, or you can do more of a survey type format. And there's been some really powerful work looking at this and finding out things like, you know, because I didn't have to buy textbooks, I was able to replace the tires on my car, so I'm not driving around on bald tires. So outcomes, the most common one, the biggest one that tends to be looked at is learning outcomes. So these are grades for the most part. Sometimes you will see that certain programs have external exams. So, for example, I know chemistry ha has an exam that the ACS has all of its majors take. I have colleagues in physical therapy. All of their students has to have to pass the PT exam in order to become licensed physical therapists. So those are often looked at as outcomes, and they tend to be looked at more quantitatively. Similar Similarly looked at quantitatively is enrollment patterns. And there's some work done on the whether students are more likely to enroll in courses that use open educational resources as opposed to courses that don't. And there's a good amount of data that shows that students are more likely to enroll in a course that has open educational resources. And then they are also then more likely to enroll in more credits. So the enrollment intensity, so to speak, is often higher if a student has a course that uses an OER because students can afford to take more courses. Um, I've looked at enrollment patterns a few different ways. One is using an actual data set from the University of Maryland system with their open textbook adoption program and found that there was an increase in enrollment intensity. So students were enrolling in more credits, although this was very specific to non-traditionally aged students who were on campus. And it seems like a very specific group because it is, but this is where diving into the data got kind of fun and interesting to me because I could tell there was something going on, but it took me a while to figure out what exactly it was, looking at the various variables that play into students, the number of credits that students enroll in. And my thinking is, and this is what I love about data, is because you get to kind of scratch your head and play around with, well, why is that? Is that students who are older than average, let's face it, are more likely to be a little more mature and make better decisions than students who are traditionally aged and younger. I know I made much better decisions at 28 than I did at 18. And if they have a cost savings due to OER, they're more likely to invest it into their education and take more courses. In addition, students who are on campus tended to be full-time students, whereas online students are usually going part-time if they are older than average. And those students may wish to take more courses, but simply just do not have the amount of time in their schedule to support that. I've also looked at enrollment patterns with OER with an experimental setup. So with this, we wrote what were called vignettes. And with these vignettes, they were little stories about courses. And there was a random assignment where either the course had an open educational resource or it had a commercial textbook, and then asking students, if this course met a degree requirement, what is your likelihood of enrolling in it? And it was much higher if it had the OER. Now, I also looked at a condition where there was open pedagogy involved or closed pedagogy, and that didn't quite make the difference. But I honestly think that the cost issue was so compelling that students really didn't notice the pedagogy difference. So perceptions. The classic way that we've looked at perceptions of open education has been quality of open educational resources. However, we're finding, as we're shifting more of a focus on open pedagogy, that getting students' opinions about their experiences with open pedagogy assignments are really valuable. One area I've personally found really interesting is looking at motivation for open pedagogy and doing work finding that students are more motivated to engage in open pedagogy where they're creating something for others to use than closed pedagogy where no one ever sees it again. Um, one study that I'm working on finishing up right now, we found that students are specifically motivated by the opportunity to help others. That helping others aspect is really fulfilling for them and motivating. And we found that with the vignette experiment where there's little controlled stories describing the open pedagogy assignment. But this is something that I think is a really important issue for us to consider as a field is how does this helping others component um, work with students as far as them having better perceptions of open education. Another thing that's important is evaluations of faculty. So there hasn't been a lot of work in looking in course evaluations per se, but the little bit of work that's been done has shown that students tend to have better perceptions of faculty who engage in open education, particularly use open educational resources. And then engagement. So, one area that I know that there's been some work on is that would be relevant to open education, but hasn't really been looked at a lot yet, is what's called epistemic emotions. So these are emotions related to learning. And so these are things like having excitement, curiosity, surprise, but then also some things that can get in the way of learning, such as anxiety. Um, that is a really potentially fruitful area to look at, especially as we're thinking about open pedagogy and how students can have mixed feelings about something such as publicly sharing their work through open pedagogy. There's also just the use of the materials. Are students actually reading their OER? Are they actually doing their open pedagogy work? And some of this can be found through things like learning analytics online, in addition to things such as interviews or observations. Something I'm planning to do in an upcoming project is to look at student reflections on their open pedagogy assignments and to take an analytic look at what their experiences were like, but in this very naturalistic approach, because students were required to do this for class. So, what were their feelings and experiences that they express in the reflection? And then learning strategies is another way to talk about engagement and to look at like how are students engaging in effective ways of learning with their open educational resources, and are they changing how they strategize their learning and how they do their work differently if they know that open pedagogy is involved instead of closed. So, stakeholders and data. I'm going to stop sharing so we can have more of a face-to-face conversation here. But I would love for people to put in the chat, for policymakers, what data do you think would be of most interest to them? And then I'll let you know my personal experiences, but I would love to know your experiences. So, policymakers, which data? Dollars saved, savings. I had a meeting with the state auditor's office in North Dakota, and that was the number one thing they wanted to know, an exact dollar amount. Yes. Enrollment numbers. Yes. Persistence in graduation and return on investment. What was the amount of money we put into the program relative to the cost savings to the students in terms of textbooks? And then yeah, and also the timeline for graduation is something that is a big focus to North Dakota or we know a lot of policymakers are really interested in how long does it take somebody to get their degree. sometimes dollar amount does not what matters is the academic freedom that it gives to educators. I have not, that was not a concern here, but I can definitely see that. All right, so narrowing down a little bit. So policymakers, these are more at the state and federal level. What about administrators? This at the institution or systems level. So, for example, the University of North Dakota, the provost was very involved in our initiatives. And then now we've been fortunate to have a vice chancellor who's a real champion for the North Dakota university system. Yes, DFW rates. I found um, I had not planned on looking at withdrawal rates initially when I did my first study in open education. I was being opportunistic, to be honest, because I was I kind of stumbled into the field of open education research accidentally, and anyway, now it's my whole personality. But my thinking was, oh, I'm doing this big change in my class. I should test it because that's how my mind works. Change something, test it, see if it makes a difference. And so I taught one section of my Intro to Psych course with the same commercial textbook. Then I switched over to the open textbook. And when I wrote it up, one of the reviewers recommended that I look at withdrawal rates. And I was like, oh, okay, that's actually not that difficult because at my institution, it's actually publicly available, the number of W's per course. And I was pleasantly surprised to find out there was a huge reduction. And then later on, when I did my meta-analysis and I was able to get data from 12 different studies, half of which was unpublished because similar to me, they hadn't thought about looking at withdrawal rates. They looked at grades. I found that there was, I believe, a 30% reduction in withdrawal rates when open textbooks were adopted. And that is something that administrators really like to hear. So other data that I know administrators have been interested in is hearing from students because ultimately they know that, students student well-being and success you know is extremely important to the health of the institution. So they do, in my experience, like getting those stories from students, actually, in addition to the hard numbers. Okay, how about our educators? Yeah, recruitment, retention, and revenue. And this definitely helps with retention. Educators. So fellow faculty. What data do you think they are most interested in?
Is it okay if I unmute? I'm an educator.
Please.
Great talk, by the way. I mean, as an educator, I think I'm always interested in a wide variety of different type of data for my students, such as the engagement data on how students are accessing it. And so that's one thing that I usually pull for like my OER book that I use for my students is I have access to that type of analytics on the back end, and I absolutely enjoy having some of that. I'm also, I think you already mentioned it, reducing costs for students is always a big one, even
Mhm.
in for multiple stakeholders involved in that space. So I think that holds true to a wide range of individuals. And then lastly, I do a lot of perception surveys for students. So students' perception of the content and the material and how they're engaging with it, especially if we're looking at do students notice the cost saved when they're being supplied those resources, even if you don't mention it? And they do.
Right,
It's just absolutely phenomenal to kind of get that perspective from the student side as well.
right. One thing I have found that educators this isn't so much a data source, but I guess a selling feature is that you get to keep the OER that you have developed. You don't have to deal with the publisher updating and changing it every year and then needing to like restructure everything in your syllabus. And then also that immediate availability is also a important or valuable component of OER specifically is showing that um, your students are going to all have the same materials too. Like you're not going to have them have five different versions because they're using used materials or no materials at all.
I think one thing to add to that is when you assign back of problems like 1, 7, 8, you don't have to update them
Yes.
every year for them. I
Yeah.
mean, it's one of those woes that you hear for educators talking when like, oh, did you know that they updated the textbook edition and stuff like that? So because in a lot of those cases you may have like control over them if you're in a press books and you can edit them, you know when they change or because you change them yourself or they remain constant throughout the entirety of it.
Right. Yes. And then a piece, the motivation piece, I've also found that educators tend to be interested in student motivation, particularly for open pedagogy. And something I would like to look into more is academic integrity and making basically our students less likely to cheat if they have open pedagogy. And this actually is our faculty development leader on campus. When I first pitched the idea of I would give talks about open pedagogy, ChatGPT had just come out, and there was a lot of panic among faculty about the ease of cheating. And to show that, open pedagogy isn't cheat proof per se, but there theoretically there should be less cheating and more motivation to do the work because you're more um you, you should be more motivated and more invested given the freedoms involved and the opportunity to make something of value that somebody else will use. And um there's also for faculty the issue of like social political costs for doing this work and to keep that in mind. Okay. Students knows the content they're facing. Yes. Yeah. Lifelong learners love that OER comes with no expiration date. Yes. So also talking about how students can keep the materials because um, a lot of the arguments supporting the use of OER for educators could also be made for inclusive access. So the whole idea of day one access to materials and all of your students having the same materials, so there's consistency there and availability. And then the promise is lower cost to the students with inclusive access, but we all know that's not really the case. But to think about those opportunities with the open licensing for pedagogy and ownership too, to be able to keep the materials, because with inclusive access, when the course is over, your textbook disappears. And if you did work on an online platform, that disappears. Right. What data do you think students are most interested in hearing about?
I would think the cost savings and then also immediate access if they've been in a situation where they haven't had that experience quite yet.
Yeah. So they're usually pretty keenly aware of how much their materials cost. I will say, anecdotally, talking to students, if they have to go to the bookstore or Amazon to purchase something, they know exactly what they spent. Um, if it is on their university bill as part of inclusive access, they have no idea what they spent. And they also generally don't know that they can opt out, or how to do that, or sometimes are they're not even aware. For example, if my niece's institution uses inclusive access, and I've been trying to get information from her about how it works, and her interpretation of it is she doesn't have to pay anything for her course materials. And I was like, well, that would have been part of the inclusive access. Like, there should have been in your bill. And I asked her, I'm like, how much was it? And she's like, oh, I have no idea. I just had it paid with my tuition. Yes. It wasn't inclusive access, but my stepdaughter found out that she was being overcharged tuition because she wasn't getting credit for Minnesota residency as a North Dakota student. We have reciprocity. And she was just getting paid the out-of-state tuition rate, which she should not have been, and she was furious. But I mean, I can definitely understand students feeling like it's got you, or like a trick that they don't even realize that they're paying for this. And yes, it's going to end up costing a lot more because of student loan interest. And those materials, they're usually set up where it's not like you can find a cheaper version. Or if there is a possibility, it's very difficult to opt out or unclear how to opt out. What's BNN?
Most likely Barnes and Noble around our neck of
Oh,
the
for a
woods.
bookstore. Right. We have Follett. So thank you. Um, I actually love Barnes and Noble, but I don't have to deal with them as a campus bookstore. It's just a happy place I take my daughter when as a reward. Um, yes. Oh no, he lost access the last week of classes. See, stories like that create very compelling data. Uh, I was told, as far as like giving testimony to state legislators, that to use specific personal stories as much as possible. I didn't have a specific personal story, so I ended up, writing up like a lot of the research that's been done on the topic that was the legislation for. But those stories are really compelling. For students, when it's money, yeah, that quantitative rings true. And I've also found just kind of telling them with grades, it is, I guess, more, maybe reassuring to them that this isn't going to hurt their grade. I've never had a student really express concern that the textbook was going to hurt their grade. I had, I have had one student in all my years of using open education over 8, 9 years now, and say that she wished I'd used a commercial textbook. It was in a statistics course, and I think she thought a commercial textbook would have been clearer. It would not. I can assure you, like, statistics is just not an easy read, no matter who the publisher is.
Speaking of statistics, and in our last 5 minutes, do you have quick tips for folks on the call if they have the data, but maybe they're not as familiar with working in statistics or working with data? What would your
Sure.
tips be?
I would definitely support partnering with somebody at your institution who is skilled in social science research and statistics. So, I mean, I'm available for a lot of this work, or I can help connect you with somebody in the Open Education Research Fellowship who is. And um, those are um, those are definitely resources that may be available to you either directly on your institution, or I can try to connect you with somebody who can assist you as well. So the statistics that are usually used in open education research, if you are an expert in this, somebody who publishes in this field should be able to do it fairly smoothly. So the best research comes from collaborations. So I definitely would encourage collaborating. Speaking of the fellowship, if I could just do a quick shout out with the last couple minutes here. If you have any questions for me, I have my contact information and my user handle for two social media platforms. Uh, I support or I mentor a group of early career researchers who are interested in publishing a research project in open education. And I plan on having the next call for fellows mid-March. So you would get to connect with a community of people who are also interested in open education. If you This is actually a great example that if you do have a data set that the analysis is not in your skill set, this is a good way to help you connect with people to find someone in within that skill set. You can also apply to the fellowship as partners or groups of researchers to work on a project together.
Another question. So if someone's just
Yes.
getting started with this, and they're not really sure where to start finding that data, what
Mhm.
would your advice be on like that initial how?
Well, if you are currently practicing open education in your teaching, then I would think about the data you have. Uh, and think about the assignments your students have done. Think about the courses you have taught. Think about even like your course evaluations. What do you already have to get an idea of what students are experiencing or how the different components of the scope framework relates to that data. Now, just because you already have the data doesn't mean you don't need IRB approval. You do. But that is where I would recommend starting, is with existing data. And then if you're planning to do a change, then think about some way that you could systematically document the effects of that change. So, if you're changing and starting a new open pedagogy assignment, think about what you expect to change in your course and how that could be measured. Um, so as far as yes, institutional research, I've gotten a lot of help from institutional research on projects over the years. They, if you want to do kind of a larger study, that is a way where you can get grades and other information across OER versus non-OER courses, or if you know courses that use open pedagogy, you can compare them to other courses. But I've been able to get things like high school grade point average is really helpful. I mean, de-identified, of course, but being able to get things like high school grade point average and ECD scores and things like that, so I can have some background student characteristics to compare and be able to say like, okay, these students were relatively similar academically speaking. Do I find quantitative or qualitative works best for students? They've required a lot less data for buy-in because they're like, yes, less expense. And then the other Thing is they have seemed genuinely motivated by the opportunity to help others when I've worked on them in my class. So they're working right now on updating our open textbook, and the data I've collected from them has been very positive. It's reassuring because they're mostly first year students, so it's a little intimidating. So I don't even know if you really need that much data to really kind of win them over. It's as far as stakeholders go.
Well, this has been wonderful. We really thank you for your time and expertise.
Yeah.
I was taking tons of notes
Oh,
about your ideas under the scope framework. So,
thank you. Thank
um,
you so much for
it
having
was
me.
excellent. And attendees were asking, will your slides or the recording be available? And
I
I
can
kind of
email them to you
posted.
afterwards. I just need
Oh,
to
yeah,
make sure that everything's screen reader friendly first.
definitely. And I can help with that too. I might not be able to help with statistics, but I can help with accessibility.
I think
So,
I only have one picture, so it should be pretty quick.
there you go. Thank you again. And for the folks online now, we will have a drop-in session in about 14 minutes. So we look forward to seeing you again if you're available. And again, Dr. Virginia Clinton-Lisell, thank you so much. Another virtual round of applause.